Good afternoon or good morning, wherever you are, as we are coast to coast today. And thank you so much for joining. My name is Jordan Alt. I am a partner in Husch Blackwell's Jefferson City, Missouri office and co-chair of the firm's nonprofit organizations and religious institutions team. I want to thank you so much for joining our program today. Before we get started, there's a few housekeeping items I need to go through. At the bottom of your audience console, there are a bunch of application icons that you can use during the program today. If you have any questions during the webcast, and I hope you do, please submit them via the question box. I'll try my best to answer them as we go. If they're too client specific, I'll let you know and we can follow up by email later on. A PDF of the presentation is available today if you click in the Program Materials folder. This program has also been approved for legal education hours. For live attendees that need that CLE credit, you can report your hours by clicking on the CEU icon at the bottom of the screen, and a certificate of attendance will be emailed to you tomorrow, along with a recording of the webcast. So you can go back and watch it as many times as you'd like, share it with your friends. And toward the end of the programs, be sure to complete our short survey. We've done a few webinars based on ideas that came in during that survey, and we've tried to improve them as we go, so we really do appreciate your feedback. That's all for housekeeping. So I want to get started with our program and start by introducing the co-presenter, Reverend Kim Jenny, who you will notice is not Reverend Nate Berneking, who was advertised. Unfortunately, due to some airline issues, Reverend Berneking is currently cruising at 30,000 feet as we speak. I won't say anything bad about the airline because they're a great firm client and we love them. But we are very lucky to have Reverend Kim Jenny pinch hit today. Some of you probably have either know Kim personally or have seen her in other presentations we've done in the past. Kim is the Director of Connectional Ministries for the Missouri Annual Conference of the United Methodist Church. Her office is responsible for a wide range of ministries, including planning and oversight of the annual conference, communications, discipleship, and lay servant ministries, and the Office of Mission, Service, and Justice. Before her current appointment, she was a senior pastor at Webster Hills, UMC, in Webster Groves in the St. Louis area. Go Statesman. She received her Master of Divinity from Emory's Candler School of Theology and completed a certificate for theology and ministry at the University of Cambridge. She also has degrees in communications from Southeast Missouri State University and Webster University. She is a diehard St. Louis Cardinals fan. She loves NASA, all things space, sorely disappointed we aren't already living on Mars, and considers herself, I like this quote, an inconsistent but persistent disciple of Jesus Christ. So, Kim, thank you so much for pinch hitting today. I really appreciate it. Your background, both pastoral and in communications and marketing, I think will really add to our discussion.
Thank you.
And for those of you who don't know me, I have a litigation background, but several years ago started our nonprofit and religious institutions team. So a lot of my time is working with nonprofit corporations and faith communities on legal issues. And my connection with Kim, other than our friendship, is I serve as chancellor for the Missouri Conference of the United Methodist Church as well. So I see a lot of names on here from United Methodist churches, and it's great to see so many familiar names there. And what I always like to do at the beginning is let you know who you are. We did this, I try to do it every major election cycle. 4 years ago, there were about 30 people that attended. 2 years ago, we had 200 sign up. This year, we had 400 sign up. Probably about 40% of you are with churches or religiously affiliated nonprofits, about 20% with healthcare organizations, 20% in education, and 20% everything else. That could be for-profits, it could be colleagues or former colleagues. It's good to see many of you on joining, or other attorneys who just love those free CLE hours. But whatever it is that you are here, we are glad you're here. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to start today by talking a little bit about advocacy and lobbying. And then we're going to transition into electioneering. We're going to talk a little bit about the Johnson Amendment and the interplay between nonprofits and political issues and campaigns. I'll talk about where the Johnson Amendment stands, and then focus on how nonprofits can engage in advocacy. I'll hand the baton to Kim after that to talk about special considerations for religious entities And then my favorite Jeopardy category, potpourri. At the end, we're going to talk through some hypotheticals, which you will see are in quotes because they're all true stories with the names changed to protect the innocent. Just issues that we've seen come up over the last 4 years and how you can deal with that. I should say at the beginning, I'm going to be talking a lot about 501c3 organizations, which will include most faith communities. I'll note that private foundations have different rules. They cannot participate in lobbying. And of course, there's different rules for 501c4 and C6 organizations. Because there are so many folks here in higher education, I'll also note that free speech issues on campus, obviously a big issue. I know I have a lot of higher education colleagues here that could spend an hour on that. We'll be focusing more on speech on behalf of the organization rather than necessarily speech on behalf of students, faculty, things like that. So let's start by talking a little bit about advocacy or lobbying. What you're looking at now is essentially what created 501c3 nonprofits. This is section 501c3 of the tax code. It says what a 501c3 nonprofit is, and the bolded language there says that no substantial part of the activities of nonprofits can be carrying on propaganda or otherwise attempting to influence legislation. Raises a few questions. What is propaganda, and what the heck does substantial part mean? You would think that the IRS or Congress would say, this is what a substantial part is. They really haven't. It's clear that charitable nonprofits can engage in some legislative lobbying activities, but there's this big gray area about what constitutes an insubstantial part. It depends largely on the facts and circumstances of each case. If nonprofits violate the test, meaning that all of a sudden a substantial part of their activities are engaged in lobbying, they could potentially lose their tax-exempt status or pay an excise tax on lobbying expenditures. The best way to determine whether the work that you are doing that may be advocacy related or lobbying is looking at your total annual expenditures and figuring out what percentage of those are related to lobbying or advocacy work. You can do that in two ways. Number one, you can look at the dollars that you are spending. This is what our budget is. We spend $1 million a year. $100,000 is spent on lobbying. That's easy, 10%. You can also look at the hours. If you have 2 employees that are spending 40 hours a week, you can just average out how much of that is spent on advocacy. And I know a lot of you are rolling your eyes as if nonprofits with 2 employees are only spending 40 hours a week. I get that that's how it goes. If you are bumping up against that and you want some more certainty, there is an objective expenditure test that you can qualify for by taking what's called the 501H election. You fill out this IRS form. Private foundations and churches can't do it, but other 501c3 nonprofits can do this. That essentially lets you share with the nonprofit what your expenditures are and what share of those are devoted to advocacy work. And then they will tell you what your lobbying non-taxable limit is. That ranges from 20% of your exempt purpose expenditures for smaller nonprofits all the way up to a hard cap of $1 million. The other thing that I should add is if you get a lot of state or federal grant money, a lot of those funds cannot be used for lobbying or advocacy. So make sure you understand your grants and that you honor any issues that may impact whether that money can be spent on lobbying. So I've talked a lot about lobbying. What exactly does it mean? Lobbying involves carrying on propaganda or influencing legislation on things like ballot measures, initiative petitions, things that aren't related to a specific candidate or party. Some of them could be general, some of them could be more specific. In Missouri, we have quite a few initiative petitions that are filed that may be changing this year, or at least how they're filed and how they're voted on. But nonprofits generally can advocate pro or anti those type of ballot measures or petitions. Electioneering is entirely different. Electioneering involves work on behalf of or in opposition to any candidate for public office. And I really do mean any candidate. As I show you here, it could be local, state, federal, or even foreign elections. It doesn't matter whether the individual is running or proposed by others to run. It doesn't require a formal announcement of candidacy. If you are taking steps to support or tear down a candidate, that is electioneering. And in most cases, in almost every case, that's going to be a pretty strict no-no. This comes from something called the Johnson Amendment. You might have heard about it a couple of years ago. It was kind of in vogue in the political debate. And what you're seeing here is the actual Johnson Amendment from the congressional record. I'm going to give you a little background because I think it's fascinating. But first, let's turn back to the language of Section 501c3 of the tax code. We looked at that middle section earlier, and now this new bold section is what I want to focus on. So we're talking about nonprofits, and the new language says, and which does not participate in or intervene in, including the publishing or distributing of statements, any political campaign on behalf of or in opposition to any candidate for public office. That language in bold is what's known as the Johnson Amendment. And I think it's fascinating. Senator Lyndon Johnson of Texas, who hopefully you've heard of, if not in that role, in some other role he held later, was running for re-election in 1954. He introduced an amendment to a preliminary draft of Section 501c3. Why? Because his opponent was receiving support from two tax-exempt groups funded by wealthy Texans, called the Facts Forum and the Committee for Constitutional Government. You would be excused if you looked at this and said, well, that sounds more like 2024 than it does 1954. 70 years later, still there are issues with these kind of groups funding political candidates. So Senator Johnson didn't like that and said, yeah, I want this amendment basically to prohibit nonprofit organizations from electioneering. Really what he said is from funding or supporting my opponent. Miraculously, I think, that amendment was agreed to with no discussion and no debate. It added this text. It was signed into law by President Eisenhower. It remained in place when the tax code was overhauled under Reagan in 1986. So for basically about 70 years, that language has come in, largely just because Senator Johnson didn't like what his opponent was doing. So we talked about advocacy. Let's focus on what exactly that means. I just got a question. Does the electioneering prohibition also apply to support ballot measures? As we'll get to, the answer is no. Ballot measures, initiative petitions, that's more on the advocacy or lobbying side. That's something you can do as long as it's not a substantial part. The difference in electioneering is when you are focused on an individual or sometimes even a party rather than an issue. So under the Johnson Amendment, the prohibition prevents nonprofits from obviously contributing to political campaign funds. You can't take tax-exempt donations made to you and pass them on to a party or to a candidate. It also prohibits public statements, whether verbal or written, made on behalf of the organization, not an individual, but the organization, in favor of or in opposition to any candidate for public office, even if only inferred. We'll get to that and what that means in just a little bit. It also prohibits any voter education or voter registration with evidence of bias. What does that mean? You can't be engaged in education or registration that would favor one candidate over another, that would oppose a candidate in some manner, or have the effect of favoring a candidate or groups of candidates. That doesn't mean that you can't be involved in the election process at all. We've talked about how you can get involved in the political process up to as long as it's not a substantial portion of what you do. But as far as the election process, certain activities may not be prohibited. For example, voter education activities. It's perfectly fine for nonprofits, including faith communities, to get involved in voter education. That could include presenting public forums, or fora, if you want to get fancy, or publishing voter education guides. You can also be involved in get out the vote efforts, get out the vote drives, voter registration, driving people to polling places, whatever the case may be. But, and this is a big but, those activities must be conducted in a nonpartisan manner and not masked candidate advocacy. For example, asking candidates how they feel about issues and sharing that information is fine, but candidate pledges are prohibited. Let me give you an example of this. There's a lot of, over the last few election cycles, as early voting became more popular, there were more and more discussions of pews to the polls drives, where churches would basically, after church on Sunday or a different day of the week, offer to drive people to polling places where they could vote. That in and of itself is fine. What you can't do is have a church look and say, all right, the senior pastor wants to support this candidate. Here are the members of the church that we think are going to support that candidate. Or here are the members of a certain income level, or based on where they live, or party registration, or who we know they vote to. You can't do that. Essentially, if you want to get involved in voter education or get out the vote, it has to be entirely free of bias. Now, in the past, the IRS was very rigid about this and prohibited any activity of 501c3 organizations related to the political process. Over time, the IRS has relented little by little. For example, the IRS has said that 501c3s can compile voting records of legislators. If you have a primary coming up, you as a 501c3 can publish a list of voting records of candidate A and candidate B. But the IRS still doesn't allow that to be biased. If that compilation includes editorial comment or approval or disapproval of votes, that's not okay. That's going to be prohibited. It doesn't necessarily mean that you have to say, here's what candidate A thinks, and you should support candidate A. Or here's what candidate A thinks, and we're going to put a little halo over their picture and little devil horns over the other. It doesn't have to be that blatant. It could be as simple as some editorial statements that tie a certain candidate's views towards your mission or your ministry, for example, to suggest that your organization supports candidate A over candidate B. The IRS is going to take a stronger approach at looking at this if opinionated information is disseminated widely, or if it's disseminated on the eve of an election. So you might say, okay, well, you've given a lot of information, but there's a lot of gray area. And you're right, there is a lot of gray area. The best that the IRS has done is offered these factors to consider in determining whether the actions that you are taking as a 501c3 cross the line into prohibited electioneering. So this is what the IRS is going to look for. Obviously, identifying a candidate by name is going to be pretty clearly seen as electioneering. Statements approving or disapproving of a candidate's action, the more you do that, the more likely it's going to be seen as prohibited electioneering. Proximity to an election. Are you doing this on a Monday evening and making calls when the vote is on Tuesday? Or an explicit reference to an election? The more clearly tied it is to the election, the more likely it is to be prohibited. Pardon me. Another issue. Is this a wedge issue? Has it been in the news? Is it clearly a dividing point between candidate A and candidate B in this election? Does your organization have a history of advocacy on an issue, including ongoing communications independent of the election? If you advocate on behalf of your mission, you don't have to stop doing it just because there is an election. But the IRS is going to take a more careful look if you're doing it for the first time 36 hours before people go to the polls. Are there non-electoral reasons for timing? And who is the audience? And what that means is how broad is the audience? And is it tailored to individuals that you think are going to support your cause? This is a great question that we just got. It said, so presenting a candidate's voting record and identifying whether they are or are not in line with, here it's the United Methodist Church social principles, is probably not allowed. I think that's generally going to be correct. I think if you want to share something and say, here's candidate A, here's candidate B, and say candidate A is in line with the United Methodist stance, or the Catholic stance, or the Presbyterian stance, or whatever it may be, or simply our nonprofit's views on this issue, that's going to be more likely to be seen as prohibited electioneering. Now, what it doesn't say is that you can't share this and say, here's what candidate A and candidate B say, and then also share something else that say, by the way, here's what we feel about these issues as a church, as a denomination, as a nonprofit, whatever the case may be. But the more closely tied those are going to be together to suggest that you are specifically saying our organization takes a stand in favor of or in opposition to a candidate or party position, the more likely the IRS is going to pay careful attention. So we've kind of gone over this. General voter guides, fine. Generally, if they involve general voting records on a host of issues. Polling candidates is okay as long as you don't editorialize. Candidate forums or fora are okay. But generally, there should be nonpartisan questions about a broad range of topics. If you have candidates to a forum and only ask them very leading questions that support your view and make clear who you support and you don't, that may not pass the smell test. It's okay to have candidates speak at nonprofits, profit events, if those are nonpartisan events. And generally, you're going to want to consider inviting all candidates, not just a certain candidate or a specific party. Get out the vote drives, like I've said, should be nonpartisan in who is targeted. An issue that comes up a lot is how do you manage employees? Employees can, of course, participate in voter education or get out the vote efforts, but it should be on their own time. What does that mean? If an employee is using company resources, that's going to be problematic. It could mean making calls from their office. It could be using their work email or a company, a cell phone that they get through the company, using a company's mailing list, things like that. That's going to be problematic. The last note here, if an employee of your organization runs for offices, particularly if they are campaigning on issues related to the nonprofit's mission, you're going to want to have pretty careful procedures in place for how to handle that. I'm not going to be that lawyer who does one of these and says on every issue, you need to call your lawyer. This is one where I feel comfortable saying, if you are in that situation, it's probably a good idea to call your lawyer and make sure that you have good procedures in place. The punishment for this, and I'm getting some questions about this, which is, for example, saying, how did certain churches get away with sending out statements about not voting for certain candidates in 2020? How do nonprofits get away with making statements in favor of or in opposition to? Generally, it's because it doesn't rise to the level of the IRS. And frankly, the IRS says a violation of the Johnson Amendment may result in denial or revocation of tax-exempt status or the imposition of certain excise taxes. There can be personal liabilities, but generally that's going to be possible in only rare cases. In reality, and this is the truth of the matter, the prohibition is seldom enforced. The most notable was in 1995. There was an organization called Branch Ministries that ran full-page ads against Bill Clinton 4 days before the 1992 election. The IRS looked at that and said, that's a bridge too far, and revoked the tax exemption. Now, what's really going to happen, and Kim can talk a little bit about this later, what we see more and more is this creates PR issues. People don't like when nonprofits take political issues or take a stand on political issues. That's not to say that not everybody likes it. Some people think it's great and think nonprofits should be doing it. But think about, do you have donors who are going to disagree with you on that political issue? Sometimes yes, sometimes no. When faith communities get involved, you're going to see #TaxTheChurch and this push to say this isn't how it should be working. And even if some of those, what you see online may be a little bit misinformed about how the tax code works, it creates a PR nightmare. The other thing is, and we've seen this in Missouri, you're going to start seeing complaints against nonprofits who are overstepping. If you follow the news, you've seen is it 86,000 new IRS agents? And so there's also this question about whether the IRS is going to crack down on this. I have a feeling that first of all, that number is overblown a little bit, but I think those agents are likely going to be doing other things than seeing whether, ex-Presbyterian church or ex-Catholic parish is overstepping here. Just because a lot of times this doesn't rise to get the attention of the IRS. But there's always kind of this question of, is it going to create negative PR issues? And even if the IRS doesn't revoke your tax exempt status, It can be distracting and expensive to have to fight against that. Now, that said, what's not prohibited? Nonprofit leaders, including religious leaders, you're free to support or oppose candidates in your personal capacity. You can absolutely do it. And you can speak about political issues on behalf of your organization, short of getting into prohibited electioneering. Meaning that you can say, my church feels this about a ballot initiative or a social issue. What you can't say is, my church thinks that you ought to vote for candidate X, or you're not a true. Now, attempts to appeal the Johnson Amendment. Some argue that the language in 501c3 is unconstitutional because it restricts the free speech rights of churches and religious groups. Others said it violates the free exercise clause. I'm going to go through this real quick because it's been years since we saw it, but this became a wedge issue during the Trump administration. And Donald Trump said when he was campaigning, religion's voice has been taken away. It was taken away by Lyndon Johnson in the 1970s because of a dispute he had, I think, with the church. This was his way of silencing the church. Not to get political, none of that is accurate, but it's still kind of pushed into this idea that got the repeal of the Johnson Amendment to be within the Republican Party platform. That was joined by figureheads in religious circles like Jerry Falwell and the Alliance Defending Freedom. And to the point of some of the questions being asked, the Alliance Defending Freedom actually started what's called the Pulpit Freedom Initiative that urged ministers, pastors, clergy to violate the statute in protest by advocating or electioneering on behalf of, in support of, or against candidates from the pulpit. On the other side of things, the National Council of Nonprofits have said, wait, the Johnson Amendment protects us because we're not being harassed by politicians seeking endorsements. We can't give those endorsements, so we're not getting hounded. The Nonpartisan Joint Committee on Taxation has said that repeal of the Johnson Amendment could cost taxpayers over $2 billion annually. Why? Because of redirected political donations. Instead of giving $10,000 to a candidate, you can give $10,000 to a church or to a nonprofit, write it off on your taxes, and then they'll give it to the candidate. And in general, most voters, evangelical pastors, denominations, nonprofits feel like this is a pretty good system. We don't want to overturn it. Generally, despite some statements that the preceding administration got rid of the Johnson Amendment, that hasn't happened. It is still codified. It's still in the tax code. I added a note here. There is a possibility of an active Supreme Court of the United States chiming in. There's no question, this is a religious freedom and religious speech issue. I haven't seen the right case come up in front of them. I'm not in the business of predicting what the Supreme Court is going to do, but it wouldn't surprise me, and I wouldn't have said this 2 or 4 years ago, but it wouldn't surprise me if there is a case challenging the Johnson Amendment sometimes in the future. The last thing that I will note before I hand it over to Kim is this case of Christians engaged. This is really the most recent issue related to this to make the news. There was a Texas nonprofit called Christians Engaged that provides nonpartisan religious and civic education focused on encouraging and educating Christians to be civically engaged. They applied for tax exemption under 501c3, and the IRS denied it. And in that denial stated that the organization engaged in prohibited political campaign intervention and essentially was operating for the private interest of the Republican Party. That got appealed. Basically, every Republican legislator from the state of Texas contacted the Department of the Treasury or contacted the IRS, and it was immediately repealed, and the tax exemption was granted. I spent a little time today looking at Christians Engaged and their most recent statements. There's some questions about whether they are, that I have about whether they are electioneering in a way that supports certain candidates over others. But even in doing that, the IRS has looked at that and said, no, this is fine, and granted the exemption. That's what I've got. I appreciate the questions. I'm going to take a look at those while I hand things over to Kim to talk through some considerations for religious entities.
Great. Thank you very much, Jordan. I appreciate it. So I'm going to just share broadly a few considerations to think about if you are representing a religious entity, whether it be a church or maybe a parachurch organization, maybe a religious institution like a college or university that could kind of tie into some of these things. Just long story short, as a pastor, as an individual, right, you can support any candidate or any issue, but as churches, you can only support issues, and only then can your lobbying or advocacy efforts can only be like insubstantial, right? The bulk of what you do needs to be in the context of your religious entity. So in the context of a church, right, you're delivering worship, right? You're participating as a community of faith, or if you're an educational institution, that's your primary role. So you need to make sure that any lobbying efforts is insubstantial to the primary work that you do. So let's talk about some of the common situations that churches find themselves in that you might have experienced or at least witnessed other faith communities participating in. So for example, a church board wants to send out flyers in support of a ballot initiative, and members on the other side get angry and say that it is a violation of the Johnson Amendment. Okay. So based on what we've heard Jordan describe about the Johnson Amendment, there's nothing wrong with this taking place. The church board sent out flyers about a ballot initiative. That's about an issue. That's okay for the church to do. Now, I will tell you, as a pastor and as someone who works at the judicatory level, it does not surprise me that people on the other side of said ballot issue are now angry, right? Because often what happens in these situations is this is really about a pastoral issue. This is about a community concern. And so what I would say in a lot of the scenarios that we're going to talk about, the values of transparency and communication and grounding any of the work that we do politically in your doctrinal statements, in your understanding of Scripture, in the values of your particular community or institution or organization is going to be critical. And then making sure that your community and organization understands what those values are. So in this case, while there's nothing wrong that the church board sent this out, I have questions about whether or not the entire group membership understood what the shared values were that would, indicate that we would support this kind of ballot initiative. Because then if everybody knows, well, of course, we're going to support a ballot initiative around literacy because we've always been about the value of literacy, and that doesn't surprise me. And even though I may vote against that particular ballot initiative, it does not surprise me that the group that I'm a part of wants to encourage us to vote on this particular issue. So this to me is, while not a violation of the Johnson Amendment, it could cause conflict within the organization. And really that's more of a pastoral or a communication issue. This webinar, the tools that we're going to maybe share and talk about some resources, good opportunities to help educate your communities about what the Johnson Amendment actually is, so that when people say things like, oh, that's a violation of the Johnson Amendment, that there's actually some validity in what they're saying, as opposed to just kind of a reactionary emotional response. Another thing that I often hear people say is, oh, something about like, well, there's a separation of church and state, which I'm convinced no one fully understands because I hear that about almost everything. To me, this is really just a pastoral issue. A couple other things to think about. You've got a church member who's a politician. They want to have a public forum in the church building. A lot of our churches often use their spaces for public kinds of meetings. In this situation where you have a church member who is a politician, this could be perceived as supporting a particular candidate and be perceived as electioneering. So really, this is about perception here. This is something in particular that I would be wary of. I think that this kind of dances along the line. We can talk about more appropriate types of forums, maybe around an issue that might be more appropriate, but this, because it's around a particular person, particular politician, it could be problematic. A church has been a polling place for years, and a member gets upset and says this violates the separation of church and state. Again, that's not exactly what that means. Churches have been polling places for years. There's no problems at all with churches being polling stations. A church wants to organize its community to drive people to the polls, especially the elderly. We've heard this a lot, especially in the past several election cycles. But I will say that it has been a critical part of the civil rights movement and the voter rights movement since the 60s. And the churches have played a major role in this. There is nothing problematic around this. The Johnson Amendment has nothing to say around this. This is not a problem. What is a potential problem is as you're driving people to the polls, if you're either bullying them or encouraging them to vote a particular way, if you're passing out sample ballots where you've marked, this is how you should vote, right? That's when it crosses the line into electioneering. But there's nothing wrong with organizing community, driving people to the polls. A pastor is asked to testify at a legislative hearing on an upcoming bill. We actually have a lot of our pastors have done that in our particular context in Missouri. That is something that many faith traditions find very important. And I would say one of the things that you'd want to do is make sure that your testimony is grounded in your faith's statements around your beliefs on a particular social issue. In the case of my context, that's the United Methodist, either social principles or our doctrinal statements or your interpretation of scripture. And this is perfectly fine. A pastor is asked to write an opinion piece for the local paper on a particular issue to be addressed at the upcoming election. Again, I've had colleagues that have participated in this. Something to be aware of, it really should be focused on issues. I would keep particular politicians out of it in order to make sure that you are not violating any kind of electioneering, or even have any sense that you are advocating for a particular candidate. And the other reality around, sticking your neck out here like this there are consequences to publicly going out there and advocating for a particular issue. Now, I often tell the people that I get to work with that there are times, right, where we are absolutely supposed to do this. This is part of the prophetic call of the pastoral office. What bothers me is when people are surprised by the consequences that they face. Right? So there will be people who are on the opposite side of where you are on this issue. Maybe even people within your own congregation who are going to react to this. And so just being aware of the consequences of speaking up publicly around these issues and being prepared for that, making sure that people in your leadership understand what you're doing. Again, to me, this is about communication and transparency with the people that you've been in charged to keep, and to the trust that you are sharing with a particular group of people. This is, to me, more of a communication concern rather than a violation of the Johnson Amendment. So don't forget about those pastoral issues. I think that it's really, really important. I think as pastoral leaders, we are supposed to be politically engaged, right? Jesus, in the context of a Christian leader, Jesus was a political leader, and so we are supposed to be engaged in politics. That's part of who we are. But it's also really important for us to think about the pastoral issues around how do we stay engaged with people who often can think differently than us, who vote differently than us, and look differently, who shop differently, right, who are in different parts of our community. And so we really would like to participate in those types of activities that are really help involve more people, get more people active and involved in civic engagement. So some of the resources I'm going to share with you is about getting more people involved in the system, because we want everyone's voices to be heard. That's some real value. And thinking about that, I think, is really really key. Also be aware that sometimes we can mask electioneering behind religious talk. And we see violations, I think, of the Johnson Amendment behind kind of this sense of, well, that's just, you know, our religious talk. That's how we talk about it. And so you can mask violations around that. It doesn't make it right. And as Jordan has noted, the IRS has struggled to actually enforce this, and we're not really entirely certain how they would truly punish people around it. But just be wary of what you're doing and when you're doing it. So especially when you've got people within your congregation that are maybe elected officials. Bear in mind the sensitivity to religion and our culture. So I think one of the pieces of, you know, tax the church hashtags that are out there and some of the complaints that we're seeing around nonprofits in particular, or accusations of electioneering or violations of the Johnson Amendment, is because of the sensitivity that is in our culture right now. And so to me, it's less about, am I going to potentially risk losing our tax exempt status as an organization, and more about what is the potential impact to the witness within my particular community. Because while the IRS may not have enough agents to come sweep into your particular neighborhood and determine whether or not you are violating the Johnson Amendment and investigate and do an audit and all of the things that they would need to do to take away your letter, I think the greater impact is if your town, your neighborhood, your community all of a sudden doesn't trust you anymore as a faith organization. So the things that you can do is to provide advocacy, right, within those restrictions. You can educate candidates. One of the questions that we had around, you know, like, you know, can you list, you know, that this candidate doesn't vote according to, you know, our denominational social principles. One of the things I do think that we can do as faith organizations is, how do you help your congregation think theologically about voting, right? Like, how do you, as a person of faith, think about how I approach an election year? I think that's a part of educating people around the voting matters. Encourage legislators to support or oppose legislation, especially if it is in line with issues that are important to your faith tradition. You can testify in front of legislative committees. You can promote voter registration. That's part of that social engagement, that civic engagement that many faith traditions have long held as important to just healthy society. And you can issue calls to action. Something must be done for something to change. So I think we're going to move into some hypotheticals.
We
Jordan.
are, and Kim, the lovely thing about this webinar is we talk about all the stuff you're not supposed to talk about, politics and religion and stuff like that. So there's been some really good questions that came in. I want to address a couple of them. Okay. Some of them we might get to in the hypotheticals. A great question. Can a 501c3 say, our position on this issue is X? Tell your House representative or your senator what you think. Is that violation? I think the answer is pretty clearly no. That is advocacy. You are not, and I think that's a perfect example of the difference between advocacy, which is permitted, as long as it's not a substantial amount, and electioneering, which is not. Saying our position is X, so you should vote for this candidate, is clearly prohibited. Saying our position is X, so you should tell legislator X, Y, or Z and share your view, that is precisely what advocacy and lobbying is. That's
and
absolutely something that can be done.
Many faith traditions have mechanisms for letter writing campaigns to their legislators using that exact format, right? Whether it's Catholic or Episcopalian or Presbyterian or Methodist, of like, hey, you know, we believe this, so use this letter format to tell your legislator to vote this way on a particular issue.
Yeah. Another good question. During primaries where both candidates are of the same party, is there the same kind of concern? The answer is yes. Electioneering does not have to, is not prohibited just for issues that are based on belief system, it would be improper for a 501c3 to say, we think you ought to vote for candidate X because, you know, his brother is a barber that cuts my hair. That is still electioneering, even if it isn't tied to your mission or to some, you know, kind of tricky issue about how you respond to a hot button issue. So let me get into some hypotheticals. And I put hypotheticals in quotes here because they are absolutely true. They are things that happen. I have changed some details so it won't be clear who did what. Some of these may sound familiar. I don't think to anybody in this list, but these are all actual things that have happened. And I will say that I think this is important because as we've seen more and more people show up to this webinar, I think some of it is because there are 501c3 organizations that have felt drawn into politics because of what's going on in a DC or in a state capital. There are others that have found themselves involved in politics and they don't want to be there. They were dragged in kicking and screaming. You know, I serve on a board, a foundation for a public school system. And I know there are teachers and administrators that are looking at their jobs thinking, how did this become political? I don't want anything to do with that. But it's same with healthcare organizations and issues of, physicians and administrators and people that just want to do their job and all of a sudden are struggling through being at the center of kind of political firestorm. So let's talk about a few. I like this one. This is the religious photobomb, and this has to do with the church. It could have to, just because that was the fact of the situation, but it could apply to any of your organizations. So here's the deal. A candidate for public office is a member of a local church and uses a photograph of himself in front of the church in campaign materials. Although the candidate did not identify themselves as a member of the church, the name and iconography of the church was clearly highlighted in the photograph. For those of you who aren't affiliated with religious organizations, I will tell you, I've seen this happen with non-religious 501c3s as well. Kim, I'd love to get your thoughts. If someone from that church or organization calls you, what would you tell them?
Yes. So, I mean, unfortunately, you know, this does happen. I think, and I see a question in the Q&A that has kind of a similar notion of being like kind of tagged in a Facebook post with someone kind of claiming to be connected to your organization, right? And in claiming, you know, some kind of relationship with your organization. I think in the case of this situation, because of the scenario, depending upon what your connection is, right? Like if you are a part of a larger organization where you have maybe a denominational body, if you have the ability to connect with a judicatory office that can say, hey, can you help us navigate this, right? Like it would be appropriate for you to contact that judicatory body to help maybe even negotiate with that candidate to say, hey, wait a second, what are you doing? Oftentimes that candidate will immediately say, oh, I'm so sorry, and remove themselves from the situation. But if you are independent or you're in a nonprofit where you're not part of our larger body, you should feel empowered to contact that candidate directly and say, you know, this makes us uncomfortable, and we think you should remove our, our connection to you because we did not give you permission to do that. And so this is one of those things. If you did not give permission for it, I think you should address it with the candidate directly. Yeah. If you are part of a system or an organization, this is where I would encourage you to connect with your judicatory or your larger network for assistance.
The other thing that I will add to this, because it's what we did here, is sometimes those iconographies of a church, iconography of your organization, it's copyrighted. So if they are using a copyrighted image that you hold the copyright to in campaign materials, that's a very good way of sending a letter, not only saying, hey, we don't really feel comfortable with this, but if you need to drop the hammer a little bit, you can say, also, you are using our intellectual property without our permission. It's probably a letter that I would have your counsel write. But that's something that you should consider is, are people using your icon? And it happens all the time. Candidates, if you go to their website, sometimes I've had nonprofits call me and say, hey, this candidate put our icon to suggest that we support them. We've never had that conversation, but they had a conversation with one person who works in one office. And we've had to have those conversations with candidates in the past to say, not only can you not say this nonprofit doesn't support you, but you can't use their trademarked icon or image as well.
Right.
I did have a follow-up question that I want to get to because it's a really good one. The question about can you say, we believe X, so call your legislators? There was a follow-up that says, do you have to keep it broad? Or can you say, we believe X, so tell this specific candidate to vote a specific way? That's where I think we go back to those factors that we talked about earlier. If this is a candidate that is up for an election in a month, that's going to be problematic. I was always advise you to say, no, lean more general here, because otherwise you are going to say, we believe this way. And if there's an indication that you're suggesting, we believe X, but this candidate believes Y, that I think veers from advocacy into electioneering. So if you can keep it broad, that is the way to go. Let's get to the next example, partly because I like these. This is something that I see all the time, and I've kind of manipulated the facts a little bit. A local church spun off a nonprofit. So you have a church, you have a separate 501c3 nonprofit that's kind of affiliated, but not really with the church. Church clergy and staff play prominent roles in leadership of the nonprofit. The executive director of that nonprofit announced their candidacy for city council. We talked about that. It happens. You need to have good procedures in place. Here's what I see happening all the time. For the next few months, the church and the nonprofit, they have events. They take photos and videos. They put those on social media. And 90% of the people at those events are wearing T-shirts endorsing that pastor or that executive director's candidacy. I can tell you this is something that I have seen with a number of my clients, a number of other nonprofits that have called me just for general advice. If you are putting things out on social media, you know, there's one thing if you pick up photographs of somebody who happens to be wearing a shirt, and there's 10 people there, and one of them is wearing a shirt advocating on behalf of a specific candidate. I don't think anybody is going to argue that that is electioneering. That's simply showing that that person was there and part of your organization. I don't think that's going to cross a line. It's not going to raise any eyebrows at the IRS. If your nonprofit has an executive director that's running and everyone in all the pictures that you share, and this happens all the time, is wearing, you know, maybe it's a parade or a town festival or something, and everybody shows up with a T-shirt with that person's name, I think that's very clearly electioneering. And putting that on Facebook is suggesting, again, you don't have to name the candidate. You don't have to say we support this candidate. But by putting all these photographs of all of your supporters and volunteers and staff wearing those T-shirts, I think that's where you're going to have an issue. And I'd suggest avoiding that. Kim, let me take this next one, and then I'll kick the next one over to you. But this is something that's come in the past. You have a prominent lawyer, small town, always played an active role in both their local church and the larger denomination, but also volunteers their time with a statewide nonprofit supporting veterans. Not only do they spend a lot of time, but they give a lot of money to the nonprofit. The lawyer was nominated by the president to become a federal judge. Congratulations to that lawyer. Here's the issue. The lawyer then reaches out to the bishop of the church and to the executive director of the nonprofit and asks them to write letters of recommendation to be shared with the Senate Judiciary Committee. Now, I'm sure some of you are looking at this and thinking, we should be so lucky then to have volunteers or donors that are in these positions. But it doesn't have to be that. It could be for judicial positions in other courts. It could be for a nominee to a state agency, something like that. The question that I got was, can we write this? Or is this going to be seen as electioneering? Now, generally, I did a lot of research into this, and what I found is the IRS is going to look at this individual as something other than a candidate. They aren't running for office. They aren't seeking election. Now, they need votes from the Senate Judiciary Committee, but writing this person a letter of recommendation that goes to a judiciary committee or goes to an administrative committee with the state is very different than making statements in support of a candidate before it goes in front of the voters in a general election. So I think if you were faced with a situation like this for a judicial position, an administrative agency, something like that, you should be fine writing that, as long as you're not taking it a step further and advocating on their behalf prior to a contested election. Here's a good one. And Kim, I'll kick this to you.
Sure.
The university's administration building is located on a busy roadway. One morning, dozens of political signs show up along the property line of the building in support of a gubernatorial candidate that has promised an increased investment in higher education. You drive down the street, it looks like that campus university or campus administrative building has signs up there. The university gets a complaint and they claim, well, technically the signs are on the other side of the property line. What would you do in a situation like that?
Well, I would remove the signs. I mean, I think anytime that you get into language of like, well, technically, it's on the other. I think you already know that you're in trouble. The key here is it's in support of a candidate. And as we've discussed, where the line was crossed is we went into candidate. We went to the candidate instead of we stayed on the issue. If these signs had been about like we support investing in higher education, the signs could be there, but that's not what the signs are. It's electioneering. So I would take the signs down or move them.
And even if I've seen this with other nonprofits here, and it's very clear that they are working with their neighbors and getting those as close as possible. So they're not technically on their property, but they suggest to all the passersby that the university supports this candidate. That's where you have to be worried, because what I found is IRS agents don't like cutesy. If you are getting cutesy with your arguments, it's going to be an issue. A question there. Now, granted, let me tweak that a little bit. If the neighbors have that property up, completely unrelated to the university, and the university didn't talk to them, you can't go on their property and remove their stuff for them. But if the university was, again, getting cutesy and talking to the neighbors and saying, hey, can you put this up? Or can we put this up 3 inches on your side of the property line? That's where it becomes problematic. And Kim, we've gotten this question numerous times, and I'm curious about your thoughts. I have mine. Can a clergy put a sign for a candidate in the yard of a church parsonage?
That's good. So I would say yes, because that is that pastor's home and residence, and pastors are allowed to support a candidate. Now, as we've discussed, right, there are, there's potential watch-outs for that, right? Like, you are definitely showing your hand to a portion of your congregation who does not vote like you. Or in the case of many of my churches, might be 95% who don't vote like you, because a lot of our pastors are not in the same place as their congregation. So there are consequences to that. But I would say that they absolutely could, in the same way that we have pastors that have Black Lives Matters signs in their yard, and those are parsonage or church-owned properties, and their board of trustees may not be okay with that sign.
And I'll add to that, it's not just churches. University president puts a sign out. There's going to be arguments that the university supports that candidate.
Of course.
A good-sized 501c3 or a well-known 501c3 organization, the executive director puts it out. There's going to be arguments that they're doing it on behalf of that agency. So you do have to worry about that there. Mm-hmm. I got 3 other hypotheticals that I'm going to run through real quick, because we're up against time, and I've had people say, hey, I want to know what you'd say about this. Caucus meetings. What happens if a political party approaches a church or nonprofit about using their space to host a caucus meeting? Generally, my suggestion is always, that seems like a bad idea. If you are hosting a party caucus meeting, it suggests that you are supporting that party. That may not be the case, and you may have good reasons for why you're not doing it, but I would typically suggest, you might not want to do that. It could potentially raise some issues. What about an apolitical nonprofit that seeks to use the same room for a candidate meet and greet, but the entire slate of candidates is from a single party? Again, anytime that you look at this and think, ooh, that could potentially suggest that we're supporting one side over the other, one party, one candidate over the other, it's going to be problematic. I think we'll probably leave it there. Just because we're running out of time, I definitely want to go through some of these. Does it make a difference if the parsonage is on the church property? I think the answer is probably no, but it makes a difference of where you're putting the sign. If you're putting the sign in front of the house versus by the front doors of the church. The other thing is, if you are in a church-owned parsonage, you may have some issues with your trustees that may not like that sign and want to talk about it. You should be prepared for that.
Yeah, it's really about communication when it comes down to it, right? Like continue, especially if you are in a church-owned parsonage, right? Like, can you have that dialogue with your church leaders and make sure that they are aware of what's happening and what like they are your landlords in a sense, right? Like, and making sure that those lines of communication are clear.
Last question that we've gotten, this has come up. Kim, you mentioned the Black Lives Matter sign. Is that allowed? Is it different? And the answer is it's different because it's not, even if sometimes it's tied to a nonprofit organization, an organization, putting that out isn't in support of or against a specific candidate. It's the same thing, for example, I have people that call and say, hey, I drive by this Catholic church and they have a pro-life sign and I don't think churches should be able to do that. And I say, absolutely, churches can do that. They have the right of every other nonprofit. Now, if they put a sign for a candidate for office, then you have some problems. But generally, issues like that are issue-oriented, that's going to be fine, whether you're a 501c3, faith community, whatever the case may be. Hey, we are at time. This has been a great organization. Kim, I want to thank you for literally pinch hitting at the 11th hour and subbing in. You did a great job. I want to thank all the people that had really, really good, interesting questions. I want to thank you for joining us today. As a reminder, for the lawyers out there, the program has been approved for legal education, so click on the CEU icon to report your hours. Tomorrow, you'll be getting a certificate of attendance, plus a recording of this that you can watch. Feel free to share with others in your organization or keep it handy. And again, we'd appreciate it if you complete our survey. We do a couple of these a year, and so if you have suggestions for what you'd like to see in the future, let us know. Otherwise, that concludes our webinar. Kim, thank you so much, and thank you to all of you out there for joining, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.